everyone. Welcome back to Cybersecurity in Focus, the podcast brought to you by Seacon Cyber. I'm your host, Katie Watson, and today I'm joined by Chris Thornberry, Information Security Manager and Data Protection Officer at Oleeo, a talent acquisition platform whose customers include central government, the police force, and financial service organizations. So what makes this conversation a little bit different is the position that Chris sits in. He's not just protecting a product, but he's protecting recruitment data for some of the most scrutinized employers in the country. And he is doing it from both sides of the table. He's being rigorously assessed as a supplier whilst running the same scrutiny on his own supply chain. In this episode, we get into what security leadership actually looks like when the stakes are that high, how you stay agile without losing control, how you handle AI governance when legislation is still catching up, and why Chris believes that the most important thing a cybersecurity leader can be is someone who knows their limitations. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. How have you been?
Good, Katie. Thank you for having me on. Very busy. Lots of security projects and tenders and customer interaction. Yeah, always a busy time for me. Glad to be here.
Thank you. I think security is one of those things that there's never a quiet moment. And in Oleeo, you have customers across the public sector, financial services, you're regularly audited, assessed. And from your experience, how does that change how you approach security compared to, let's say, like a SaaS company in more of like a mid-market retail company?
Yeah, so I think with recruitment, obviously you're dealing directly with kind of outcomes of people's employment. So there's a lot of kind of legal ramifications around that. So right throughout the whole kind of journey of a candidate, there's lots of touch points in terms of security and data protection legislation. I think that's amplified across the customers that we deal with. So obviously there are a lot of high profile in kind of central government and financial services. So these are really kind of top tier industries where, regulation and kind of auditing is quite heavy. Very much process driven. Yeah, it's always something that's kind of hotly debated. It's always something that kind of keeps me really busy with auditing and talking to customers about data impact and legislation.
And from your experience, you are assessed, I guess, both as a supplier, but then you also have to assess your own supply chain. How do you find doing both of those things?
You have to kind of segment them out. I think obviously our primary role to our customers is a data processor. So we have to kind of assess our ability to process, store and manage data as they wish. They're the data controller in that sense. So they give us instruction in terms of how we do that. And then with our own, so obviously we're recruiting ourselves, we are gathering data ourselves. So we are controller for our own data. So we're often using the same suppliers for both mechanisms, whether it be things like identity verification or, referencing right to work checks, all those types of things. So we have to segment it out. And we have to understand the kind of the boundaries between when we're a processor versus when we're a controller, and then kind of tailor our approach accordingly.
And would you say one of them is like harder than the other?
I think when you're not, I say legally in control, but when you're not in control as a controller, I think you have a lot more responsibility because you have a very set instructions to your customers, so your data controllers. So from a law background, I'm not a lawyer, but from a legislative background, the onus there is kind of the shift that you have to do. If you're not processing data how you said you will, or hold it for as long as you say to your controller, obviously there's a huge legal ramification there. When you're setting the boundaries yourself as a controller, I think that for me is a lot easier because it's just your organisation data versus the many hundreds of customers that we deal with. So there's a big difference there.
I think because security is so essential to what you do and your product, and like you said, you're dealing with people's careers, their personal information, you have loads of that because of the nature of what you do. There is the potential for security within your organization to become a blocker. How do you avoid it and help security enable the business rather than hinder it?
Yeah, so I would say, previously security was always, secure but slow. So you would do things very methodically, very diligently in a set routine. But obviously the landscape isn't like that anymore. We have to be more secure but agile. So we have to kind of move at pace with the demands that we've got. So that comes with things like processes where you can automate things versus where you do have to have manual review. I think it also here at Oleeo, I encourage a good kind of security culture. So people are already thinking about implications before they bring things to me. So in terms of reviewing things and kind of implementing, whether it be other vendors or suppliers, they're already thinking about the questions that I would ask. So that kind of stops that bottleneck as well. And then I think it's also about the type of people that we're bringing on board. So the suppliers, the transparency that they offer. I think especially as we move, and I'm sure we'll talk about AI in a bit, but as we migrate to more using AI services, the transparency around that becomes the central piece now, because a lot of the other things you just take in terms of being assured to certain certifications as standard, it's more about beyond that now. I think it's about transparency and data residency and things like that.
I think that's such a good answer, and you definitely gave me the perfect segue into AI. I could not have asked for a better segue. We've spoken a little bit about regulation and governance, and the legislation on AI, because it is so new and rapidly evolving, it's kind of sort of always playing catch up. How do you make governance decisions when the rules haven't yet been written?
Yeah, this is the catch-22, I think, of this situation. And me personally, I can speak for this. We've invested a lot of time really understanding legislation and ethical development of AI. We position ourselves very much as a AI augmented platform as opposed to kind of a fully automated platform of AI. We still want humans to be at the forefront of all the decisions that are being made. So that gives us some leeway, I think, in terms of both from a legal perspective, but also from an ethical and development perspective. We're building products that use AI to suggest recommendations to a human. So we want the human-centric element there. In terms of adapting to that, we have to move quickly. But sometimes legislation and governance hasn't moved as quick. So if I take an example of things like high-risk AI systems, the EU hasn't set up things like the database for registering high AI systems, but it's already in legislation that they will need to be registered, and things like conformity assessments and kind of data protection impact assessments of high AI risk systems. So we're aware of all these things. We take a lot of time to study the law. As I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I do take time to that. We kind of mould and shape and understand the guiding principles of AI legislation. So I think that, coupled with our understanding from other frameworks, that really helps us to cement our place, so we know exactly what we need to do to be transparent, to be ethical. And we also engage with our customers. A lot of these customers, if they're in the EU, they might have more insight and forethought into AI. EU AI Act, for example. So we're transparent and we engage, I think, is the way forward. But we always make sure that kind of how we develop it is ethical and transparent at heart.
The ethical element and transparency is something I haven't come across before. It makes a lot of sense when you build with those principles and those behaviors that we obviously see dictated already in certain legislations and the fundamentals of cybersecurity. I guess you are building in a much more secure way and fashion anyways. So you've obviously done so much work within the AI, both in terms of how you use it in your product, but also as well, internally. For someone who maybe is in a similar position for a company, but they haven't yet adopted as much AI, or they don't know where to start with it, what advice would you give someone looking to implement stronger AI workflows within their organization?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always start with people in the organization. I think they have to have a accountability across the company. So it's not just the people who are developing AI. As you said, we're all using it in some capacity. So I think, really getting that culture of accountability. So anyone who's using AI needs to understand fundamentally how it works, whether it's a model that trains on your data or doesn't, if it's a model that you can put sensitive information on or not. So all of these kind of fundamental guiding principles, I think everyone should know about AI. And then building out like you would do normally, frameworks like 42001 for an AI management system, for example, would look at making sure everyone is trained on AI. So there's a consistent performance and metric there, and making sure that everyone has a kind of acceptable use of AI. So they understand the implications of, putting sensitive data into a model, as I said. So I'd always start with that framework first, always start with people in the organization. What you don't want to have is a situation where people feel that they can't either suggest AI tools or they use tools or want to engage with tools that haven't been security reviewed, for example. You don't want to have kind of a shadow AI situation, because that becomes obviously unmanageable and difficult to kind of roll back from, depending on how much it's been used. So I'd always start there. and make sure kind of there's an understanding right across the business that AI governance from top down, everyone's accountable for its use.
So with shadow AI, how do you prevent that? Do you just straight up block? Because you don't want to just block everything. Does it come back to the education element?
I think so. And I think it comes back to my personal view. I'm very pragmatic as a security person. I would always entertain ideas of tools that can be beneficial to people. I would never put blockers in the way. Having said that, I think it's important to understand kind of the use case for that tool. I always try and see if we have an existing tool that can solve the same problem. And if we don't, then it's a case of kind of going through that review process, like we said. So understanding the use case, understanding kind of what data. So data is always my kind of North Star. So what kind of data is going to be used in that AI and how does it benefit you? And then you can work back from there. So you can kind of think about things like back-end things like permissions and access control and things like that. But I think the guiding principle is always the same. It's understanding what data will be used, understanding the use case, and then going from there. So I would never want to be a business blocker or a bottleneck with people wanting to use it, because I think, as we've established, we have to use AI to keep growing and keep developing with the pace.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that it is becoming essential to keep up with the rapid change of how other organizations are doing things, but you have to do it in a secure fashion. So I guess AI tools are kind of like a third party in that sense. And we've sort of touched on it, but you assess a lot of third party tools. What are things that like would instantly disqualify a third party for you?
Yeah, so I think, as I said before, traditionally would it be things like having a certification, let's say like ISO 27001 or SOC 2 report. Now it's going beyond that. So we're talking like in the AI space, we're talking about transparency. So I'm not just looking at that particular supplier, but I'm looking now more at the supply chain. So where does the data go from once we send it over to you? How is it processed? So we're really looking at the whole ecosystem of that supplier versus just a point in time of that particular supplier. So transparency is a big thing. I still think good security practices. So, I mean, a lot of the times, I see kind of on security or privacy policies, they might hide a little bit behind big companies, kind of, we have it in, we use this data center, which is really secure and, X, Y, and Z. So I look more about what are your policies beyond that? So what are your policies towards your people, your background checks, your company as a whole? What's your kind of your particular security policy? What does that look like? So it's kind of unveiling that. So I would like to think that, most suppliers are very transparent about those practices. And if they're not, then that for me would be a big red flag, because then it's kind of, you do need to be transparent with things like that, I think, in terms of like data residency and kind of your specific security policies for that company.
Transparency seemed to be really key. And I think it's because it's a risk, right? That's what it is. It's a risk for you to go into business with someone, to send them data. And it's about building trust, and transparency is one of the key things to do that. So it's quite like you go to quite a lot of scrutiny, you analyze things. How does it look in practice? Do you say just send me your report? Who do you talk to? Like, what does this actually look like in practice? Because I think the theory is there for a lot of us and a lot of people, but it's the day-to-day, it's the actually taking that action. Like, what do you use to actually ensure this process happens and happens successfully?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to that process, we don't want to create bottlenecks, but we do want to make sure we do the proper due diligence. So quite often when a third party is brought to us as a proposition, we'll do kind of a cursory check on the kind of the company as a whole. So we'll look at kind of things like how long have they been trading for, what's their financial status, what jurisdictions do they serve, what other customers do they currently have, and even have a natural, tangible thing in common with us. Then we'll look at the practical aspects. So quite often you might have to sign an NDA with the third party or the vendor. But once you've got that, you can then have access to things like all the documents they're reporting, penetration tests. So really getting under the veil of the more broad security. It's more about specifics. So that's really what we're looking for. So we'll be looking for key documentation around that. I would want to know things, because with a SaaS platform, you're responsible for everything. So you're responsible for your sub-processors. So anyone who's a customer of ours, the expectation is that we've done all of this due diligence and we are vouching for that third party. Essentially, by an extension of our services, they are part of Oleeo. So from that side, we need to have complete assurance right from the get-go. Otherwise, we can't use them. So we look at the policies. We want to have engagement with them. We want to ask them questions. So if it's about a particular how we're going to use them, I would want to be on a call with someone from their side and talk about how is this going to work practically? How are you going to get the data across to you? And so you've got different layers there, I think, in terms of how you would look at it. I think each one is equally as important as the other.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's really helpful to hear the types of steps you take and the level of detail you go into. And you mentioned you are a SaaS platform, and with SaaS, I think we're seeing like DDoS being one a big threat, and ensuring constant availability of your product. How do you approach that and ensure that you are prepared for example, a DDoS attack?
Yeah, so I think obviously the first point is acknowledging the landscape. We can't hide behind the fact that these attacks are happening more and more and a higher volume. So you have to, first of all, recognise that. I think you have to put things in place. I think, in terms of perimeters and kind of edge infrastructure, I think you're going to have to lean on your partners and your customers. We're fortunate to work with customers in central government who might have a broader knowledge or understanding kind of geopolitically or things out there. It's about having that kind of intelligence sharing as well. So I think you can be prepared for that. I think it's also understanding and engaging with customers directly. So from their own experiences, if they're seeing things or activity maybe on their own sites, things that we don't host or we don't directly service. So it could be things like that. So it's always about intelligence. Obviously, I think automation has to come into it because, the sophistication of these types of attacks is getting more and more. And yeah, I think it's just being as prepared as you can. I think it's about having good incident response. I think it's about, again, awareness and culture within the business and making sure kind of you're testing as much as you can these types of capabilities, or certainly if you've got other technologies in place that you're leaning on those suppliers and vendors to demonstrate their ability as well, because then that cascades down in terms of that trust element that we were talking about before.
And that's how you build resilience, isn't it? And that's the key focus now, is resilience and making sure that in the event of an attack, you are able to withstand and business operations are able to continue and you are able to carry out that incident response plan. So you mentioned, incident response plans, and how often do you update those or carry out those exercises? Because we've got that awkward situation where everything is evolving so fast. Does the paperwork, do the practices, do the procedures evolve fast enough as well?
I think all of that has to evolve and change. It would be before a once and done exercise, like a tick box. You would do like an annual walkthrough. You would do one would give their kind of their just opinion about it. Now it's more and more regular. I think significant changes and testing has to be done every major kind of input that you get. So whether you get new intelligence, whether you get new indicators that could pose a risk or a change, you need to look at that. We're quite fortunate. I mean, we get a lot of testing throughout the year through different means. So it could be through customers, it could be through our own independent testing or engagements that we do as well. So we are doing it more and more. But I think the stagnation can come from if you're not engaging with it across the business. I think, and like I say, if you're doing that only once a year, then that stagnation can lead in. And then when it comes to time of an incident response, you want people to be ready. They want to feel that they've had training, they've had awareness, they've gone through a response plan, everything is clear and concise, and everyone has a delegation of responsibilities. I think making sure those things are ingrained and they feel like second nature, I think those are the kind of the key things that would differentiate someone who can react quickly in a situation versus those who kind of would shy away a bit. So it's a little bit like fight or flight, but it's kind of making sure it's ingrained, I think, in our process and our business.
You've really had a lot of influence at Oleeo over those processes and procedures, like you said, and the people. And I think your clear knowledge of your security approach and your opinions on it is really grounded in experience. And I think I want to ask, what is, over your time at the company, one of the things then you are most proud of implementing, particularly as so much change has happened?
I think, so security and awareness and culture, I think that's really developed. I take great pride in kind of talking when we do company meetings and kind of, we have monthly engagements where I can kind of, talk about the landscape, or I can talk about specific features or projects that are coming up. So having that, I think that's, for me, is quite a source of gratification. I would say kind of as we develop and automate our business, that's going to be a big thing going forward. So there's a lot of groundwork going in now for things that will come to fruition, hopefully within the next kind of 12 to 18 months. So I think those are the things I would say are the big things. I can't talk about specific, in terms of what we're doing, but I know that there are significant projects and changes, like fundamental changes within the business, especially as we come back to AI again, as we develop things like AI and we use AI more, that kind of then lends itself organically to security changes in the business. So I'm really happy and proud to be driving those across our organisation.
That's a really positive outlook as well on what we are seeing, where we see it a lot where security now needs to become a business enabler, and you need to talk in terms of language the board understands, mention risks, etc. Like that is a really prominent conversation at the moment. And that outlook that, okay, yes, it does mean that a lot of security teams are changing their communication style, etc., in order to convey their points a lot better to the board. But the really nice impact of that is that now security is a business enabler. All of those things that businesses are able to do securely and safely are a direct result of the hard work of security departments. And that correlation and, like you said, that gratification that you get in your job is, and hopefully that is a way that security, it won't be just, a job where as long as we're not attacked, it's going well. It's actually enabling progress and prosperity for a business.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite fortunate with Oleeo. We're quite a tight-knit organisation. So we have, really good communication right from the top down. Our CEO is very approachable, you can talk to him about anything. I mean, it doesn't have to be just about security, but it's something that is really at the heart. It's baked into every part of our department and organisation. So not just our software, but all of our teams. So that culture I was talking about, it makes it a lot easier for me when there's a really good culture and awareness. Because when you do bring things up that you would like to see to come to fruition and projects, you can deliver that in a way that people are kind of already half on board because they understand the importance of security. I think for me personally, I've come from more of a kind of a customer and client service background before kind of technology. So being able to translate, it can be very difficult. You really have to have a shift between a technical mindset and a technical way of speaking to talking things that will resonate with leadership. You talk more about things about, return on investment. You talk about how this will help reputation, how this will help the brand, versus specifics of just this is going to cost X amount of money. I think you've got to really resonate with your audience and kind of tailor that communication. You dial back the technical, but you talk more about the benefit of introducing a project or a technology, what the customers are talking. So you might talk to customers about specific things, or after an incident's happened, if you're talking to customers, you can feed that back. So it again has an additional weighting and resonance because it's not just me saying it, it's coming from our customers as well, and that often will resonate more with leadership team and people if you're talking to boardroom and what have you.
That's really interesting. I've never heard the customer point being brought forward, because normally security, they're not a customer facing role, but that makes so much sense that if it's coming from demand in the market, if it's what you're seeing, if it's, whether it's a certification or, your customers probably actually asking, let me see your pen test report, etc. Let's actually read the SOC 2, like go through the analysis of it, see what it is, that would drive the board and key decision makers in an organization to change things. Do you think that what your background in being customer facing, what has really translated really well from that into your role now? Are there any key skills that have really helped you in your career?
I think, like I was saying, just being able to kind of tailor and switch your communication style. Quite often you have to try and explain very technical problems in a very relatable and easy layman's terms. I'm not always just talking to other counterparts, my peers in security with the customers. I could be talking to low-touch end users who have a more kind of, let's call it a more simpler grasp of technology. So you have to be able to kind of tailor that. And I think that's always the case. It doesn't matter, what line of business you're in. You have to have an ability to be able to tailor your language to suit your audience. So I would say that has been one thing. I don't think it was necessarily a part of my job description, but I think it fell to hand that it would help to have someone in a security role who is comfortable talking to customers. So typically, I mean, a security role, they might not be customer facing as much. They might not be willing to be transparent and join calls and talk about security. Whereas we see the opposite helps. We're able to get someone who is in a security role, who can come onto calls, who can come onto tenders, who can talk about security, but then can tailor that language so to suit the audience. I joined a call the other day. We were talking about we had doing about a tender that we're looking at, and we had different people on the call. So we would talk about our different points of view and things like that, and then you'd have questions. So you might get a really technical question from the security lead, and then you might get a really kind of a low touch question from someone else on the call. So that flexibility and that tailoring communication, I think, is really important in certainly for me personally in my role.
That is brilliant, and it makes a lot of sense to what we're seeing in the market as well with customers and where they're needing more support and where they're trying to drive initiatives. It's all about that ability to communicate and change your language style depending on who you're talking to. And that makes a lot of sense. I think what have been the biggest challenges you've experienced in your role, and especially being a SaaS company? Are there very specific SaaS related challenges you've had?
I mean, always a challenge is things like competition and making sure that our product is as compatible and competitive as possible. Our product is highly configurable, so no one solution looks the same. And obviously comes different security challenges. So there's full autonomy on the solution in terms of how it's configured. So things like, access control or authentication or things like that. So those are big challenges to face because you can't have a standard response for each customer. Each customer can be completely different to any other customer and how they use the platform. For me personally, I think just there's always an ongoing challenge with making sure that you have the most up-to-date knowledge, experience in terms of knowing the kind of the landscape, the industry, the technology. That's always a challenge that's going to be there. I think you have to be able to kind of also admit when you don't know things. I think that's a really important thing to highlight. In security, people often think you have all the answers all the time. And I think it's being able to do the opposite of that. It's being able to kind of understand your limitations. I'm quite fortunate in my role that I have a really good team around me. So I've got really good experts who are infrastructure people, who are DevOps, who, senior developers who understand cloud versus on-premise. So I can lean on people around me who have got a lot of experience. I think it's understanding that as well. So having a limitation barrier. Those are always challenges, but I think the way you approach them is what would define you in terms of that situation.
That's a fantastic answer. And there's so much to unpick in that from, your personal challenges. And I completely agree with you. Constantly learning. I think that's where that sort of inside knowledge sharing really helps as well. And having that network of people around you that will support you and provide you with information. To what we're seeing, I think, a lot in the space is the personalization of SaaS products and making them so customizable. And that's completely increasing the attack surface then because of how many integrations you need to have, etc. And we're seeing that a lot with the use of AI, particularly vibe coding, etc., allowing people to create applications very specific for their individual needs. When someone's approaching this as a security leader, what advice would you give them?
Yes, I mean, we're not at the stage where we're allowing kind of full autonomy of development of application. I mean, we still have very strict kind of guardrails around our software development. Secure developing and coding doesn't change just between kind of our standard product versus our AI augmented solution. I think we still have very rigid guardrails in place to kind of really to create familiarity amongst the developers, but also to just to allow us to keep control while we kind of expand. I think we've been very measured and kind of cautious around how we expose AI in the product. Because I think it's always an opt-in function. For example, we don't kind of by default just throw everything in there and everyone get on with it. It's more a case of we're a lot more measured. We've done a lot of heavy testing with customers, so we with any product, not just AI, but we always have early adopters, so people we get feedback from, who we can kind of really lean on and talk to, and kind of they can help us iterate the product through its development. And then outside of that, the solution that we have and we sell is highly configurable. So there are so many variables that could happen, sometimes to the detriment, because I guess when you develop a solution, you always have an intention of how it would be used versus what is possible if you were to bend kind of configuration or things like that. So there's always kind of nuances with everyone's systems, and kind of, I guess that inherently gets worse because the more you kind of bend and tweak the system could potentially create issues. So there is always that, I think, but we also have a kind of a standard, and we have really good customer teams who look after our customers and kind of can support them from a technical perspective. And then the AI side, we come back to the responsibility of development, I think is absolutely key for us. So we lean on people who have experience, whether that be kind of our internal staff or external consultancy, people who can help us with things like bias and ethical development. But we're very, very measured. So we've taken our time with this. Obviously, we've made a very strategic pivot towards AI features and functionality. And I think that would be obviously, like with a lot of companies, that would be the kind of the really heavy direction of travel, but we're doing it so in a way that's really kind of keeps our values at heart, which is being kind of transparent, being measured, and being trusted advisors, because that's one of our brand values, being a trusted advisor. I think so people lean on us for that.
It's very interesting as well how the answers you've given and everything, they do line up with the values of the company, and it's showing how embedded security is in the organization, not just as something to protect the organization, but to also live and breathe those organizational values. This has been a really, really helpful chat, Chris. And the last question I still have for you is that what is something you wish you had known earlier in your career and that you'd like to share with everyone to help them?
Well, that's a good question. I think, coming back to like the limitations, I think there's always that kind of, imposter syndrome with security. I think it's really understanding your limitations. I think if I'd have known that earlier, I would have put a lot less pressure on myself to always think I have to have the answer, I have to know. So I think it's recognizing that first of all, and making sure you've got a good team around you, people that you can kind of lean on, get experience from, but always just kind of have that ability to want to get more knowledge. I think you can't stop doing that in security because the pace is always changing. So I would say those things are the two things I would have told myself a lot earlier.
Amazing. Thank you so much for today, Chris, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katie, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. A massive thank you to Chris for being so open and practical throughout the entire conversation. There was a lot in there that I think will genuinely land with people working through similar challenges. Now, a few things we kept coming back to. Security culture has to be built top down, and it has to be felt everywhere in the business, not just lived in one team. Transparency from your supplier and also from yourself is a non-negotiable. And when it comes to AI, being measured and ethical from the start is not a constraint. It's actually what makes progress sustainable. If you found this episode useful, please do share it with your colleagues, leave us a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week with another conversation. So see you then.